So first of all, thanks a lot for inviting me. It's really an honor. Thanks to Stamos, thanks to Nikos and all the team. It's really nice to see some familiar faces and also to discover some new faces and some new names. I hope I will meet new friends, let's say. I'm going to tell you about something that's, in my view, is quite timely. It is controversies about the colonial past. I will focus on one specific national past in relation with colonialism, which is the Belgian colonial past. But I hope it will speak to all of you. I mean, to different kind of situations related with colonialism, and there are a lot of them. So what I want to do today is to give you a brief theoretical approach of collective memories that we can also call social representations of history. I will not make the difference here, whereas I know that it's possible. Sometimes we should. And then I will try to give you an overview of the research we did in Brussels with Olivier Klein and other colleagues on social representations of Belgian colonial history in the Congo, focusing first on intergenerational differences, then focusing on the content and structure of those representations, on their narrative shape, and then on their links with contemporary prejudice and acculturation processes. And I hope I will have time to conclude with something more theoretical. Okay, it doesn't move when I click. Okay. So collective memory is a concept that was not coined, but popularized by Maurice Halbwachs, a French sociologist, who gave different kinds of definitions of collective memories, but we can choose this one: a set of people who remember as members of a social group. Another way to put it is that collective memories are shared representations of the past based on a common identity. It's interesting for us social psychologists because it's a concept that lies precisely at the interplay between the individual and society, which is about individual attitudes, individual cognition, if you want. But it's also about the public sphere, it's about power, and it's about history. I'm of course not the first one to deal with that in social psychology. A lot of colleagues, some of whom are present today, did a nice work in making connections between concepts in social psychology and in sociology and history and so on. But I will not take too much time on that. Just to focus on some aspects of collective memories. First, their current functions. Halbwachs wrote that collective memory only retains from the past what is still alive or capable of living in the consciousness of the group who maintains it. And similarly, the psychologist Bartlett wrote, with the individual as with the group, the past is continually remade, reconstructed as a function of present interest, which allows us to make connections between the present needs, the present mental states, the present representations, emotions of people, and the way they represent the past. It's also a concept that was linked, that has been linked with social identities. It was apparent before, but it was stressed strongly by Dennis Hilton and James Liu, writing that history provides us with narratives that tell us who we are, where we came from, and where we should be going. It defines a trajectory which helps construct the essence of a group's identity, how it relates to other groups, and ascertains what its options are for facing present challenges. So social representations of the past are not only about representing the past. It's about defining an identity. It's also defining what you're supposed to do as a social group in the present and in the future. And that gives me an opportunity to pay some tribute to Dennis Hilton, who left us a few months ago. Okay, so let's start with the empirical part. straight about the work we did on collective memories of Belgian colonialism in the Congo with Olivier Klein, but with a lot of other colleagues, some of whom are present. So if you come to Brussels or the rest of Belgium, you might not notice it because it's not always obvious, but there are a lot of traces, of material traces of colonialism. There are streets named after famous colonialists like General Fivet. You will find statues of Leopold II. He's the second king of the Belgians. He's also the colonial king. You have avenues that were built during colonialism and in relation with it. You have a museum that is now the Museum of Central Africa, but actually it was a colonial propaganda museum until recently. Some buildings that were made with the colonial money and so on. It's all around the city. What I'm going to propose and present and describe today is a tale of two opposing collective memories. You will see that there are contrasting memories of this past. On the left side, you see a benevolent kind of representation of what colonialism was, a paternalistic one, with Tintin in the Congo, with this artwork showing that some Congolese were freed from Arab slave traders. That our education was brought to the colony. The Belgian king in the 60s was so, 50s, was so welcomed in the Congo. How it brought evolution, science, and so on. And on the other hand, you have also, that is also available in the public sphere now, it's a very negative one, a negative tale of cruelty, of massacres, of violence, of crimes, and of total lack of respect for the colonized. And that's the least you can say. Just to make you, to allow you to understand the memory issues, some points about history, very briefly. So there is an anti-colonial history in the Congo, as in all colonized countries, that is not well known, that people don't know. And in the colonial propaganda, the pre-colonial period is described as savagery, as nothingness, let's say. Actually, there was a history, there were kingdoms, there were empires, there were city-states, there were international relations with the West and the rest of the world in these countries. From the mid-80s and to the 1870s, there were some explorations of the Congolese territory by Livingstone and Stanley, as you might know. There is a depiction of Stanley in the Congo. And early on, the King Leopold II was looking for a colony, and he started funding Stanley's expeditions. In 1884-85, at the Berlin Conference, the colonial powers met and they divided Africa among the colonial powers, the imperial powers of the time. And the king of this small state, the new state that was Belgium, managed to get a large territory in the center of Africa, that was the Congo. It became a kind of private property of the king, which makes it quite an interesting and original kind of colonial history compared to other nations, the independent state of the Congo. He cedes the colony in 1908 after there was a humanitarian campaign denouncing the atrocities in the Congo. He dies in 1909. I want to know more about what happened during Belgian colonialism. Then independence was achieved in 1960. Joseph Kasavubu became the president, and the famous Patrice Lumumba becomes the first prime minister. Then there is a period of chaos, some violence, some secessions, and it ends up with the assassination of the prime minister, Patrice Lumumba. Then there was a long period of dictatorship by Marshal Mobutu. And then recently, Laurent Kabila took the power. He was assassinated. Joseph Kabila, his son, took the power. Then he was elected, and then another election brought Félix Tshisekedi to power, and he's still in power now. The situation now in the Congo is contrasted, but why difficult? It's one of the poorest countries in the world, but there are also it's a very dynamic society, and it's getting towards democracy and so on. There are some hopes also. Okay, it's a controversial history, and somehow the controversy came when Adam Oxkine, who still is an American journalist, published this book, King Leopold's Ghost, at the end of the 90s. It was an extremely negative picture of the Leopoldian times, the time when Leopold II was let's say, the owner of the colony. And he wrote, for example, from 1880 to 1920, Congo is the setting of one of the greatest holocausts of history. More than half of a people of 20 million men is exterminated. Okay. Olivier Klein and I, at the time, were very much interested in national identities and threats to national identities and group-based emotions such as collective guilt. It was in fashion at the time. And when we read this book, we thought it was extremely interesting because this kind of thing is extremely threatening for social identity. Trust me, I'm Belgian. When I read that, it was not easy to read. What he describes is behavior like forced labor for the trade of ivory and rubber, physical punishment, atrocities like cutting hands of the people to justify the spending of ammunition. And he writes that 10 million Congolese died from killings, mistreatment, epidemics, hunger, exhaustion, and so on. I put interrogation mark because the figures are disputed, of course, and sometimes for good reasons. But the veracity of the atrocities is not contested today. Recently, this colonial past was brought to the fore. It started at the beginning of the 2000s, but with the Black Lives Matter movement, it reached a peak in spring of 2020, with statues of the King Leopold II being painted red, to remind the red rubber, the blood of the Congolese spent for collecting rubber. And the connection with today's racism was made explicit. For example, this pardon, asking for the pardon, and racism painted on the statue. And that's what we are dealing with at the moment. In June 2020, our king, our current king, expressed his deepest regrets for the acts of violence and suffering inflicted on the Congo in the letter to the President Tshisekedi. It was the first time that something official was done in relation with colonialism in Belgium at that scale. So what's at stake? It's a question of identities, not only, but it's also a question of national identities, on both sides, from the colonized and from the colonizers. And it's also a question of contemporary relations between Belgians and so-called Belgian and so-called Congolese. In international relations, it's extremely important, and also in intercultural relations within, for example, Belgium, between Congolese immigrants and other Belgians. I'll start with some research on international differences. So we were interested, as I told you, on collective guilt. It can be defined as a feeling. You can feel guilty by association with your in-group, even though you didn't do anything wrong, just because you categorize yourself and you identify with the social group that in the present or in the past did something wrong to another. It's the emotional side of collective responsibility. In that study, we collected data from our students in psychology, but we asked them to have the questionnaire completed by one of their parents and one of their grandparents. So we have 3 generations of Belgian respondents here. It was published. So we measured colonial collective guilt. It's closed-ended questionnaire this time. These kind of items. When I think about the colonization of the Congo, I experience guilt as a Belgian. So who feels guilty for colonialism in this country? The data from that research, not non-representative, but still, show that the ones that feel most collective guilt are the students, followed by the parents, followed by the grandparents. We have a linear trend that we'll find all the time. It's not strong because it was a 9 steps scale. And it's always the case with collective guilt. People are not so joyful when they express this kind of emotion. So it's usually low, but the differences are significant. We also asked them if they supported symbolic reparation, apologies, or material compensations. And you have the same kind of trend. Students support reparations, the parents a little bit less, and the grandparents not. So the question is why? Why do we see those differences? The path that we followed first and that I will develop today is the differences in socialization. The reasoning is simple. It's linked to Albrecht's social frameworks of memory. The idea is that people tend to remember the events that were salient during their adolescence and early adulthood. You are influenced by what you learn at the beginning of your life, and then the influence is decreasing. In that case, if you compare the grandparents and the students, it's clear that people of that age were socialized in a pro-colonial environment with colonial propaganda and so on, whereas the students were not. Anti-colonial environment is a bit excessive. It's less colonial, less pro-colonial environment, let's say. And we can check that. For example, we asked them, to what extent do you feel informed about the history of colonialism in the Congo? And you see that the grandparents feel more informed than the parents, who feel more informed than the students. More interestingly, the correlations are different. When between group-based emotions and the feeling of being informed. The more students feel informed, the more they feel collective guilt. They feel guilty about it. Their parents less so, and the grandparents totally different. The more they think they know about colonialism, the more they are proud of it. Sorry for the French here. It's fierté is pride. So they are proud when they think they know about the Congo, whereas the students feel guilty. In another study, we compared only 2 generations, and we focused on representations of the king, of this famous colonial king, Leopold II. We submitted a series of characteristics of the king to students and retired people. And we identified 2 factors, a positive one, humanist, generous, patriotic, visionary, and so on, and a negative one. He was a cupid king, megalomaniac, cruel, and so on. And what we see is a nearly perfect interaction. For the students, he was cupid, he was a cruel king, megalomaniac, and so on, and they reject the positive side. The retired people endorse the positive side, philanthropist, altruistic king, and they reject the negative. You have really an inversion of the representation of the king. Then we also try to measure what we call social representations of colonial history. It's a bit limitative, but we submitted a series of things that happened during colonialism, that could have happened during colonialism. And you ask them, when you think about colonialism, what are the things that come to your mind? Forced labor, exploitation of the Congolese, racial segregation, mutilations, massacres, use of natural resources for profit. All those negative things formed a factor that we called exploitation. On the other side, there were positive things like educational system, building hospitals, building roads, economic infrastructures, the work of churches and missionaries and so on, and that formed a more positive factor that we called development. It's not a single factor. We always find 2 independent factors, okay? And we'll find that continuously. I will show you. So we compared, of course, sorry, I'm going too fast. these representations between the students, the parents, and the grandparents. What you see here is the students. They retain exploitation and they reject development. The parents in the middle and the grandparents the opposite. Okay, for the grandparents, it was forced development, and then they reject all the accusations of atrocities, etc. For the students, it's the opposite. So we also find an inversion of the representation in another study with different participants. And so. Interestingly, also the correlations are interesting. What we also find all the time is that the exploitation factor is predicting emotions, is predicting attitudes and so on, but not the positive factor. So for all generations, thinking of colonialism as exploitation induces collective guilt, okay? But not the representations in terms of development does not prevent you from feeling it. It's totally independent. So in sum, from these studies, group-based emotions are linked to social representations of colonialism. Only the exploitation, negative dimension is working, is doing something. Social representations of colonialism depend on generations, and this difference in the differences in socialization partly explain generational differences. I have other arguments for that. Okay, I want also to talk about, yes, about those measures of representation of this two-dimensional model. We try to check if it was stable across countries, and especially across formerly colonizing countries and formerly colonized countries. Okay, and we wanted to know how it related with group-based emotions and attitudes towards reparation. So we had a sample that we collected thanks to James Lewis World History Survey. So we managed to collect data in 3 formerly colonizing European countries, Belgium, France, and Portugal, and also colonized African countries, Angola, Burundi, Cape Verde, Congo, Guinea-Bissau, and Mozambique. We treated them as 2 clusters here. I don't know why it appears like that. So we measured social representations of colonialism with the same scale, collective guilt and shame, support for reparation, and national identification. What we managed to obtain is a kind of stable structure of the scale of measurement of these social representations of colonialism, if and only if we got rid of 3 items belonging to the development dimension, were probably much more ambiguous and were interpreted differently as a function of the country. But the rest was stable across all those countries. We looked at the means, and you see that the exploitation factor is more endorsed by the European respondents, all students, by the way, it's quite important, than from the African respondents. And the development followed the inverse tendency. So the development was more endorsed by the African respondents than by the European respondents. But remember, it's the young generation, students, the ones who criticized fiercely colonialism in the study I just presented. Group-based emotions, collective guilt was more, collective guilt is endorsement for the Europeans and assignment for the colonized. It's assigned, you should feel guilty on the other hand, and I accept guilt on the other hand, okay? What you feel, you see is that, of course, African participants assign more collective guilt than the Europeans endorse, and they are more in favor of reparation than the Europeans. So nothing surprising. Correlations are all, again, interesting. When you correlate that with collective guilt, the exploitation is predicting or is correlated with collective guilt in European countries, but less so or not even significantly in African countries. And the same for development. it's negatively correlated with collective guilt among the Europeans, but not the African. When you correlate it with reparation, you have more or less the same trend. It's important for the Europeans, but not less so for the Africans. They support reparation, whatever the feelings they have, and whatever the representation they hold of colonialism. Last result for this study, correlation with national identification. In Africa, among African respondents, there is a positive correlation between thinking about colonialism in terms of exploitation and identifying with their countries. And you have, of course, the reverse effect with development, but nothing with significant for European countries. So it means that social representations of colonialism are linked with the conception of national identities in formerly colonized countries, but not in formerly colonizing countries, as if this colonial history was left out of the building of the national identities in Europe. Okay, that is what I just said. What time is it? Okay. I'd like to show you also this recent work that was just accepted for publication. It's about the narrative shape of those memories. So, as I showed you before, I can show you again, you know, this contrast between these different kind of representation. We postulated that, and we know that there are actually two different kinds of schematic narrative templates, master narratives about colonialism in the public sphere in Belgium. You have first a pro-colonial narrative, according to which colonization brought peace and prosperity to a savage and poor Congo. Just an example. It was always in a spirit for evolution in order to bring the Congo to an evolved stage and make it emerge from its black forest. So there was nothing before, and then arrived the colonized, and it became something more structured, peaceful, prosperous, and so on. But you also have an anti-colonial schematic narrative template, according to which colonization brought violence and disorder to a peaceful and prosperous Congo. For example, here an interview with a Congolese immigrant who said that before the arrival of the colonizers, Africa was very organized. There were ways of talking, of palavering to solve problems. But when colonization arrived, it was either the chicots, the whips, or the rifle, so the violence. So we hypothesized that as a function of the attitudes toward colonialism, Belgian participants would refer to different schematic narrative templates that are available in the public sphere. And as a consequence, the representations of the situation before, during, and after colonialism would change and form different implicit temporal trajectories. For the pro-colonial people, the shape would be inverted U-shaped. Negative, then arrive the colonization and it goes better. And then the colonizers leave and it goes back to disorder. And for the anti-colonial, it's exactly the opposite. It was nice. Then arrives colonialism and violence and mistreatment and racism and so on. And then independence comes and the situation is improving. And that gives me the opportunity to pay tribute to another important ancestor that left us a few years ago, because he was very influential in this work. So we did a small survey where we measured attitudes toward colonialism and social representations of 3 historical periods: before colonialism, during, and after colonialism, in different domains: peace, conflict, economy, health, well-being, politics, and so on. For example, before the Belgian colonization, the Congolese territory was torn up by wars and slavery, and then during it becomes depacified and so on. What we get is this. What I'm going to show you is the model as predicted by regression analysis. And I will show you the slope, the shape of the narrative that is formed by those three representations at different levels of the scale of attitudes, at level 1, at level 2, at level 3, etc. Starting with level 1. Level 1 is the most negative attitude towards colonialism. What you see is that it starts relatively high, then it decreases during colonialism, and then it increases again, but less so than it was before, because people know that the situation is difficult after colonialism. If you take the second step of the scale of attitudes, you get that. The third step, you get that. Fourth step, so it's the middle of the scale. 5, 6, 7. So passing from the anti-colonials to the pro-colonials, you have an inverted shape. It goes from a U-shaped narrative to an inverted U-shaped narrative. We did that. That's just a description, but we did that correctly with the appropriate statistic, measuring the effect on a quadratic term, and it's highly significant. What is particularly interesting is that the representations of what was before colonialism is extremely different. It's quite different between as a function of attitudes. We even showed that there was a negative and strong negative correlations between what I don't know who's drawing on the. You can draw, but everyone sees it. Oh, well, I see it at least. Yes, the representation of anti-colonial history is quite diverse, but the representation of post-colonial history is quite consensual. Everyone, more or less everyone agrees that it's a difficult situation. But of course, the narrative freedom, Andrea, you're drawing on my slide. It's nice and beautiful, but okay. Yes, I told you there was negative correlations between attitudes toward colonialism and the depiction of the situation before colonialism. Okay, we can discuss that later. Just some quick research now. Are there links between prejudice towards Congolese in the present and those social representation of colonialism? So we did that very recently with Simona Lastrego and a student, Zoe Magonet. A survey with Belgian participants. We measured social representations of colonialism with our bi-dimensional scale, and we measured attitude with the thermometer, so purely evaluative measure. And what we found is that the negative exploitation dimension of the representations of colonialism is positively related with attitude towards Congolese immigrants. The more you acknowledge exploitation of the Congolese, the better are your attitudes toward Congolese immigrants in the present in Belgium. Again, the positive dimension had no independent effect on these attitudes. Then another quick result: collective memories of colonialism and acculturation dynamics among Congolese immigrants. What we did with Anna, who is present today. So I won't tell you what is acculturation. What happens when cultural groups come into contact. And in the acculturation literature, quite often you distinguish two dimensions: the maintenance of the culture of origin versus the adoption of the host culture, which produces also orthogonal models. So we measure that. It was a qualitative method here with a small sample, but I'm just going to show you some correlations paradoxically. Okay, yeah. What we got. So we calculated an index of positive social representation of colonialism and negative social representation of colonialism. And we calculated the Spearman correlation with acculturation dimension, maintenance, and adoption. What we see is that the negative representation of colonialism is associated with more maintenance attitudes, of keeping the culture of the origin of the group, and less adoption, so not mixing with the majority group when you have these negative representations. Again, the positive representation was not related with that. Interestingly also, there was a link with lack of recognition. The more you hold negative representations of the colonial past, the more you feel a lack of recognition in Belgian society today, or the other way around, of course. So you find negative representation of the negative representations of colonialism are associated with more maintenance of Congolese culture, less adoption of Belgian culture, and a feeling of lack of recognition of prejudice towards Congolese. No effect, as usual, of positive representations of colonialism. And so it's an important aspect that, in my view, should be explored a little bit further, is the link between representations of the past, of the colonial past, and acculturation dynamics. There seems to be a link between the two. Do I still have some time, Nikos?
Not really, 1-2 minutes maximum. Laurent.
Okay, yeah, I'll try to wrap it up then. Just some reflection, and not directly linked with what I just presented, but how to make sense of those mobilization of representations of colonial history. For example, the severed hands that are represented here by an artist. They came to symbolize the oppression of the Congolese during colonialism. For example, a Congolese participant told us the Congolese were mistreated by the Belgians. They were made to work like slaves by cutting off their hands if they did not make the effort demanded by the white man. They say that. Sometimes they say it with some historical inaccuracies. They would say that they were cutting their hands for picking up the cotton, for example, which never happened. It happened during the collection of the rubber. We know that. Okay, so, and sometimes they think it happened during Belgian colonialism, whereas we know that it was during Leopoldian colonialism, let's say. So how to make sense of such statements? The question is how to interpret, to make sense of collective memories. Should we interpret them as a proof of the weight of the past? So we are determined by the past. We remember the past because this past is weighing on us. It's like a trauma. We cannot escape it. If your group was traumatized in the past, you have to live with it. Okay, you are passive. It defines the present situation. Prager said it's a kind of neo-Freudian approach, to make a kind of metaphor. But you can also think of collective memories as a choice of the past, where you strategically use the past to convey a message, to mobilize, to do something in the present, through a process of social construction that is linked to the current social identity. It's a more neo-Durkheimian approach, let's say. And in my view, social representation theory is useful because it can combine the two approaches somehow. Because with the process of anchoring, of course, it's the process that comes easily to mind when you think about the past. Any new situation, if deemed important, is apprehended in the light of the already known. For quoting Moscovici, thus our representations make the unfamiliar familiar, which is another way of saying that they depend on memory. Okay, so it's anchoring. You think first of anchoring. For example, any current discriminatory behavior of Belgians towards Congolese living in Belgium can be compared by analogy to the cruel treatment suffered by their ancestors. And somehow it's a process of anchoring. They cannot help it. They have to live with it also. So the past weighs on the present. But it's not that simple, because in the same paragraph, Moscovici wrote, experiences and memories are neither inert nor dead. They are dynamic and immortal. Anchoring and objectifying are therefore ways of handling memory. There is something more active in this process. When someone is saying your hand is being cut off, it evokes concrete, vivid images. such as this one. For example, it was a statue, and some activists cut the hand of the statue to make it more realistic as a function of the Congolese history. So there is an objectification, in fact, of a feeling, of a discourse that is materialized by evoking in discourse or in artwork or in behavior this kind of images. And these images need to be interpreted. They are signifiers. And we as social psychologists has to make sense of those signifiers and to find the signified. Actually, what is this person telling me at that moment? I would say in this case, by describing a historical event, the subject expresses present feelings, sentiments, or takes a position in a current debate. So historical inaccuracy is not the point. What some pro-colonial people in Belgium say when there are accusations, they say it's not true. It doesn't correspond exactly to history. But is it the point, really? I don't think so. The point is, what does the subject mean? When they mobilize reminders of cruel treatments during colonialism, they reveal a feeling of non-recognition in the present. So an image of the past is replacing a discourse, a complicated discourse about the present, and they objectify it so it's not deniable. It's just present, it's in your face. You have to show it, to see it. You cannot escape it. Actually, you don't see it most of the time. And when they show it to you, you cannot escape it. It's present. So it seems to describe past events. In fact, it denounces present injustice. And this is why it carries a truth, even though it's not a historical truth, but it's still true. It's anchored in an experience and in feelings and sentiments of the people who utter this representation. Okay, I think I've finished. Thank you.